thank you. Okay.
Now it's live?
Okay. Yeah, he said he doesn't know. He said just according from there, according.
Okay. Okay, good morning. So being that we're concluding the year Tavshin Pei Beis, going into Rosh Hashanah, and I've also been doing the Seder Atzilus. Last week I covered the parsois, the partitions and boundaries and borders between all the ilmus and all the madregas. So I thought everything's Hashgacha Pratis, so it's very fitting because this is really the story of Rosh Hashanah. The story of how every year Rosh Hashanah, there's the Histalkus, like the Alter Rebbe explains in Siddur, Mittler Rebbe, the Siddur im Dach, that is Alter Rebbe's Mamorim, Mittler Rebbe published it, and the Rebbe brings it quite often, how before Rosh Hashanah, all the elements and all the spheres are Eila Lamaila. Like in Geras HaKedesh, Simin Yudalad, when the Alter Rebbe explains on the Pasuk, Eini Hashem Elokecha ba mereishis Hashanah bad achar Hashanah. So he says, why is Reishis Choser Aleph? It's missing Reishis without an Aleph. And why does it say Reish Hashanah? If it's Reish Hashanah Achar Hashanah, it should just say Kol Hashanah. Why do you have to say from beginning to end? That means the whole year. So he explains, because before Rosh Hashanah, there's a Histalkus, what's called Durmita Deza, or Durmita, which is a form of sleep. That the Elamis and the Spheres all are Eila L'mayla, in anticipation for them being renewed through the Tfilis or Tkir Shefer of the Idna Rosh Hashanah. So the Choser Aleph is the Choser of the Histalkus, that's why it's missing an Aleph. And Reish Hashanah Achar Hashanah, because every year this is renewed. It's not just a perpetual automatic process. At the end of every year, Achar Hashanah, right before Rosh Hashanah, everything goes into this like slumber, like sleep, only to be renewed again. So Bakesa is like the concealment of the moon, which happens right before Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a Chodesh as well, only to be renewed in the new year, in the new month. So this is based on the Arizal, but in the Atzilus we were discussing. So essentially, Atzilus is, as we spoke about the vision, Elam Achdus, where Elokus is Begoli, and Iyu v'Chayu Echad, Iyu v'Gamu Echad. After that comes Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. How does that happen? So Malchus is the interface. Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Keser of Beriyah. And in the language of Nigla, El Pi Nigla, that on Rosh Hashanah, what does it say? Tashatam lechumni aleim and bameh b'shefer. That's why we say Malchi is a Charein Shefris, because every Rosh Hashanah we're Mamlich, we crown God as king, which is essentially we're being Mamshech Malchus from Atzilus into Biyah. That Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Keser of Biyah. If we didn't do this Aveda, so Chassidus says, there would be a bit Simtzum Behelim, the Eibishter did not destroy the world, but it would be very much concealed. And then Ayin Beis uses the language would be B'derech Memshala, similar to how it was the first 6 days of creation before Adam came on the scene. So the Eibishter created the world, Sheish Yamim, and it was only until Yom Shishi, when was the first Rosh Hashanah. Till then, the Eibishter was also Moishel and Odin Kol Eilam. Adin Eilam, B'terem Kol Yitzur Nivra. Even before creation, he's Adin Eilam. But especially even before Adam. So that is essentially Mamayla Lamata. Excuse me. Mamayla Lamata, that the Eibishter is creating the world. But the Kavanah is that Adam should now be created B'Yom Shishi, Rosh Hashanah, and from here on, he should be Mamlech the Eibishter. So sometimes the language in Chassidus, you may see the expression that before first Rosh Hashanah was Halos Man Minei Ubei. Have you seen that expression? What means halos man minei bay? The whole idea of halos man is halos mayin nukfin, is like an asus nilotata that comes from us. We initiate through our avedim from the bottom up. Minei bay means that the first time there was no one to initiate, there was no human being. So when we say, for example, ben min nimlach ben ishmersein shel tzadikim, who did God consult? The neshamas of tzadikim, but there were no tzadikim yet before the creation. So Chassidus explains that the Eibishter was mitzayer. It's like shir atzmei b'keach, in his own so-called consciousness. Lifnei tzimtzum is mitzayer what tzadikim, the tzadikim that will come, and how those tzaddikim will give him nachas and so on. Like the Maggid, the Rebbe brings from the Maggid's moshel, like a father that's mitzayir in his mind, olah b'machshava, Yisrael olah b'machshava. That's before they were created. That he's mitzayir, he envisions in his mind what his child will look like. Like even before the child is born, a father in the moshel Gashmi can envision what would my child look like. Obviously, Lamaila, it's even a much higher level, because the Eibishter is more than just envisioning it, he creates it. But the point is that the first time it's halos man minei bay, and after that, after Rosh Hashanah, it starts becoming our Aveda. Now, if hypothetically, which is not possible, because even if no one was mamlech the Eibishter Rosh Hashanah, there's always going to be one person. There's always one tzaddik at least. But even hypothetically, there was no one to crown God as king. Nevertheless, so Chassidus says there'd still be memshola, but it wouldn't be meluchim. Malchusei berotzen kibla aleim is only possible when in the language of Chassidus, when there's nifrodim. You can't be a melech on bonim, on children, or on family, or on loved ones. It's on nifrodim, it's on strangers, on am, hanifrid, am meloshen emamus. And that is ein melech b'lo yam. So ein melech b'lo yam. So what would happen if there was, kaviyah, so to speak, no am? So the Chassidus explains it would be minimal. It would be like we speak about, sometimes you speak about, the Rebbe has a famous sikha in Chelik Tes, Likutei Sichos. It says that on Shabbos there's this Talkus Eilemis in Chetzenius Eilemis. Rosh Hashanah is Talkus Eilemis Beprimius. So the Rebbe asks, what happens when Rosh Hashanah's Choli is B'Shabbos? So then you have Chetzenius and the Primius. So how is there a world? So the Rebbe explains it's the Chetzenius of the Chetzenius. I don't know if you learned that sikha. But the bottom line is that the world will continue simply because the Eibishter wants it to be here. But to say that it has, like you do work with a full chayis, no, it's not full chayis unless there's Avedis Adam. So bottom line is, it's in our hands, Tamlichuni Aleichem. I add one more thing. In some Maimorim it brings that Pirush, Ein Melech B'lo Yam. Ein in Aramaic, it also is in. In Zayar and other places, the word in means yes. I know it's opposite of ein. Ein means no, and in means yes. So sometimes it says in Maimorim, in Melech B'lo Yam, there is a Melech without an Am. But that's Lifnei Tzimtzum, and that's Lifnei Ishtalshlus. In other words, in Ishtalshlus, ein Melech B'lo Yam, because that's the Eibishter, Kach Ola B'Ritzeinei, that's how he wants it. But there are Madregas that is in Melech B'lo Yam, there is the Eibishter, because the first time, who put everything in place, the Eibishter was the one that decided that he has a Rotzen Ano Emlech, I want to be a king. Then he created all of his talshus. Takim mitzad nesava kosh baruch aliyas leis baruch dir betachtenim. But that all comes from above. So there is the concept of a melech, but it's a melech that's not the full shlem. The real way a melech is, the Eibishter wants a relationship. A melech that just decides he wants to be a melech on people is not a real melech. That's why it's berotzen, malchusei berotzen kibla alei. So that's a little context. Where does that play itself out? In the highest levels, it plays itself out in Malchus of Ein Sof, the Malchus before the Tzimtzum. And that's where all this Shir Atzmei B'Keach and all that I just described, the envisioning, Kach Yisrael Olam Machshava, and the B'min Nimlach, that's all in the Malchus of Ein Sof, Lifnei Tzimtzum. But as we know, there's also the microcosm, Elam Kot, which is in Atzilus, the Protis, so Malchus of Atzilus is what becomes Kesed of Beriyah. So in the language of Chassidus and Kabbalah, Rosh Hashanah is essentially being machtir and being mamshich Malchus. Lesla megamo klum, Malchus on its own has nothing. But we, Avedis Adam Lamata, in Beriyah, are able to be me'edir and stimulate and arouse and awaken, that's the language used, the Malchus in Atzilus, and to be mamshich it down below into Beriyah. And that's essentially what happens on Rosh Hashanah. The renewal of, put it in simple English, without all the Kabbalistic terminology, the renewal of our relationship with God. The renewal of our commitment That's basically Kabbalas Malchus is total commitment. We're ready and say we completely Kabbalas El Malchus Shemayim. We accept you as our king, and we want you to accept us as your Am. This doesn't preclude other relationships. We also say Im Kibonim, Im Kavodim. We say in Kionu Amecha. There's the Am and the Melech. There's the Roya and the Tzayin, Mamirecha and the Mamir. There's a lot of relationships. Like we say in Kel Dedi. We say Rayosi, Tamosi, Dedi. What's the fourth word? I said Tamosi. What? Rayosi, I said. Okay, it's 4 Lashonos there, but kids. Bottom line is that there's many relationships. They're all correct. Like in learning Chassidus, sometimes it's Av and Ben. Sometimes like Aved, the Bechinas Eved, and the Bechinas Ben. He speaks in Samach Vav and other places. So that is just a context, a bit of what we're talking about in the context of Rosh Hashanah. So continuing on, and I'll do this more in the new year. I think when is going to be the next Seder? After next Thursday is the Seder? Yeah? Oh, between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur? And then after that, then that will be it. Yeah? After Yom Kippur, there's no more. Till after Sukkot, right? Okay, so I'll continue then and continue on. But so the next step is really understanding now the transition from Atzilus to Beriyah, which, again, the language that I just spoke about is really what happens Rosh Hashanah. So let's talk about that a bit more, and in the context, as I said, of this time of the year as well. So, but B'kitzur, if Atzilus is an Elam of Elokus, Elam Ardus, so you may recall 2 weeks ago I spoke about the order of the worlds, like in a structure. That you have the Elam Ardus, or the blueprint, the vision of existence, how the Eibishter sees existence is Atzilus. Beriyah is already the structure. But it's the beginning of the structure. It's a Chemer B'loi Tzura. That's why it's not Yitzira yet. In the language of Chassidus, there's different words used when we understand this. In many ways, it's, as I said, it's also a way of understanding what happens on Rosh Hashanah. So we have B'Psarech Zalakah, we have a good example for it in our own lives. 2 examples that are easy to relate to, or relatively easy. One is Yitziras Havlad. How does it work? No one's born just as an adult, or even a child. It all begins with a conception. Conception is just one cell, in the language of biology. So where an egg is fertilized by a seed, and you have a cell. Then the cell begins to split. After 18 hours, I believe, is the first time the cell splits. And then it will continue to split and start developing into what becomes a fetus. And that's the gestation period that we call pregnancy. And as the months pass, the child begins to develop. If you were able to see under a microscope those early stages, you don't see, it looks literally like a dot. The size of a hair follicle. And that will become, that seed can move in everything in it, and that will develop. In the first trimester, second trimester, you could start seeing the development of the head, then of the limbs, and slowly, but probably the 5th, 6th month, even earlier, you could start seeing most of the outline of a child being developed. And by the, of course, the end of the pregnancy, you have a full, with God's blessings, a healthy, perfect child, and the child is born. So why did the Eibishter make it this way? It could have made that it should take a day, it should take a minute, it should take because it's a dogma of how Atzilus works. It's also that way. I spoke about this many months ago when we spoke about Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim. It also works that way. The Eibishter could have created Atzilus. He said, Bereshis bara Elokim, poof, and existence is here. But he didn't do it that way. He did it in a 6-day process. And even in that was also, as Rashi brings from Medrash, Bereshis bara Elokim, everything was first in Anakuda. And then each day, he was Megala. So, Basarim Amaris Nivra Elam. But Bereshis Nami Maimirhu. So everything began as a klal, and from the klal came the pratim. The second example that is used so often is a similar example, but just not with a human being, a seed in the ground. An apple tree, let's say, drops a seed on the ground. The seed looks like, we all know what a seed looks like. Exactly, and a kudah. You would never know if you didn't know better what a seed is. But this seed, planted in the ground, and properly cultivated, and watered, and nourished, this seed will grow into an apple tree. I'm talking about apples, just a dugma. It could be an orange, it could be a rose branch. I mean, that's just a different species. So the same idea, the seed begins always as a nekuda, everything's concentrated there, and as it develops, you can actually see the process. You can go online, you see mamish, when you speed it up, you could see the fascinating process of how from a seed sprouts into it begins to emerge and then it begins to blossom, and it grows and grows and grows, and that's where a tree comes from. So all this is a dugma of essentially how Beriyah Elam came to be. In many ways, this is how it's nischadish every year, Rosh Hashanah. The only difference, and this is important to emphasize, is that even though we say in Sherichad V'Amunah that Yisavas b'chol rega v'rega, and it says mamish mikyesh ma'ayin, and ilu, if what would happen if the Eibishter was not mechadish the Beriyah miyesh ma'ayin, it would go back ayin ve'efes mamish k'may sheishis yimei k'may lifnei sheishis yimei bereishis mamish. That's what he says right in the beginning of Sherichad V'Amunah. Alel Hashem dvorcha nisu b'shamayim. And yet, even though the Rebbe doesn't say it there, but in other Maimorim, it's not created mamish anew. Because if it was anew, then we would be constantly born anew, like newborn children. So there's an expression in Chassidus called Chidush HaYeshenus, or Chidush HaYeshanus, that it's mechadish the Beriyah mechadish mamish, but in the tzura that was there a minute before. So even though right now, every second this is being recreated, but this bima is here before, and we don't see that shina. It's not yesh ma'ayin as it was the first time. The first time there was no bima here, and there was no wood, and there were no people. But from then on, it's renewing in an existing form. And the way that we remember the second before, because if we were really renewed every second, we would forget our lives, and every second we need to relearn everything we know. So it's very clear that the world, even though it's Savas B'choreg, I'm just saying it because, it's not so much the point I want to make in this year, but it's something a lot of people don't really pay attention to. And someone asks you the question, what means Savas B'choreg or Mechodosh, Mamish? What do you mean? The world is not Mechodosh, it's the same world exactly as I saw it a second ago. And that's not an illusion. It is Al Pi Halacha even like that. There's a thing called Apul Nimshachas in Halacha, or other things. So clearly we reckon with the Metzias that was a second before, Metzias after. If it was Mamish new, so the answer is that it's Mechadash Hashem, is that the Chiddush is really in the Chayis. It's like renewing energy. Just like electricity has to be renewed all the time, but it's renewing in the form as it was a moment before. So essentially when we say the world from Atzilus to Beriyah, we're really saying is that in Atzilus it's an Elam, but it's an Elam as it is in the way the Eibishter wants it to be. Like the architect and the blueprint. So everything is Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'garmu echad. Beriyah is first time you use the word bara, is in the world of Beriyah. In Elam is the Klolos, Beriyah the Klolos is usually Adam Kadmon. But Beriyah means that there's what the Ramban says right in the beginning of Bereshit. Beriyah is a word in Hebrew, the only word that talks about creating something ma'ayin liyesh. So in this context, Atzilus would be like a ayin, and Beriyah would be called Isavas hayesh. So let's talk a moment what that means exactly. Because if you think about it, the simple klotz kasha is, what do you mean? Atzilus is not a yesh. Compared to higher than Atzilus is also Metzias. So what's the difference between Metzias and yesh? And here, of course, we don't mean yesh as we say yesh when if I bring with someone and tell me you're a yesh. That's a balgaiva. Obviously, it doesn't mean that. It means, yesh means that there's something of substance. And the best really word for it that I find is there's an identity. So even though Atzilus has an identity, it's called Atzilus. And it has a personality. And it has spheres in it. So you can't say it doesn't exist. But every part of Atzilus is always margish, betivay, not through Aveda. Atzilus is margish that it's only an extension of Elokus. So just we talk about Ovis, Hein, Hein, Amarkava. So they existed. There was an Avram Avinu that walked on this earth. And Yitzchak and a Yaakov. And yet we call them a Merkava. What's a Merkava? A Merkava is also a Metzias. It's not that it does not exist, but its whole Metzias is to be a chariot, a vehicle, for whoever's riding on that Merkava. So if 24/7, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Kol Yimeyim, and every second of their lives, they felt that all I am is an extension of my Creator. Like so, Chesed of Atzilus, like Avram, is all he knows is my job is to bring Chesed to this world. We look at ourselves, for example, we don't feel that way. You can do Chesed, and you can be a big Baal Chesed, but to say 24/7, all your whole Metzias Be'elim is to do Chesed in this world. We're not on that madrega. That's the definition of a yesh, that there's another entity. Now that entity can choose to be mevatel itself and do chesed. But that's why we call bittul hayesh. And then there's bittul b'mitzias. So the difference is, a bittul b'mitzias, the Rebbe I think writes in the Shuvas Abiyurim, printed today in Igros Kodesh in the first volumes, in the piece on when the Rebbe explains the difference between va'ed, echad and va'ed. So I think, I'm trying to remember the exact words, it's very shmak. The Rebbe says, I think, bittul mitzias, he says, is the thing is bottle, like be'etzem uhusei. And bittul hayesh is that it exists and it's mevatel itself. So it's a very different type of bittul. So Beriyah is a very high world. Beriyah is a Gan Eden Elyon, Malachim of the Srofim, Emdim Amalei. So let's not dismiss what Beriyah is, but compared to Atzilus, it would be like, just as a dugma, the difference in the Alter Rebbe and Rab Hillel, in the famous story, Teira Shalom, he brings it, that Erev Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe would fall asleep for a few minutes because he was bedugma shal Maila, and La Maila is the dormita, just like at Rosh Hashanah, there's b'me'enza every Friday, so the mitzvah de zah. So Alter Rebbe, who was aligned with that, was bedugma shal Maila, and therefore he would fall asleep a few minutes before Shabbos, or I don't know if it says how long he. Rab Hillel was a heiche madrege, but he was not on that level. He didn't fall asleep. He went to sleep because he knew that's what happens at that time. So that's the difference. One is natural because he's just like a merkava, a neshama of Atzilus. One is more like a neshama of Beriyah. I'm not saying Rab Hillel's level of Beriyah. I don't think I saw that anywhere. But as a dugme, so both are bittul. But one is a bittul be'etzem husei, it's just that's who he is. And the second one knows that's what you have to do, and therefore he does it. And the rest of us, you figure out what you do out of Shabbos at that time. So that's already Yitzira, even lower, Asiya, Gashmi, Schum, huh? What? Mitzrayim, okay, good. A little chant for some. Te'emel Chaim Zachu. So Beriyah, therefore, is what this calls the Scholas Esavas Hayesh. Sometimes you'll see the expression that Beriyah is Efsharius HaMetzias. Now, what does that mean? It means that even though Efsharius HaMetzias means it's only like a potential, but it's not. Fi Erech Yetzirah, which is already called a full entity, Beriyah is like a dugmi, like a clay, a piece of clay, chemer without a tzura. So before you shape, let's say, a piece of clay or a piece of gold into an ornament or a takeli, what does it look like? It looks like a clump. So it's not, you can't say it doesn't exist. There is a piece of clay, but it doesn't have a tzir. So sometimes it's called Efsharius HaMetzias. It means it's like the beginning before you start shaping it. In the context of what we're talking about, it means that it's already the beginning of what the yesh is about, but it's not yet fully developed. In a sense, a little like what I said before about the fetus or the seed. It's there, but you don't see any protim. So that's the second point. And finally, third point, you'll see sometimes it says that Atzilus is kulei teiv, lo yigur chara, ein ra yered mumayla. There's no negative energy in Atzilus because there's no room for it. In Beriyah, it starts saying it's the beginning of Isavas Hara. So it'll say Rubei Teiv u'mi'utei Ra. In Yitzira, Mechza Teiv, Mechza Ra, half. And Asiya already becomes Rubei Ra and Mi'utei Teiv. And Elam Hazeh Agashmi, as Alter Rebbe says, Moli Klippus V'Sitra Achra. And the Shem gave him a break. That's Kulei, not Kulei Mamish. A Rubika Kulei is controlled by the Helen Behester and the negative. So Beriyah is the beginning. Now when you say Mi'utei Ra, the word Ra doesn't mean evil as someone's murdering someone or there's crime in a Beriyah, obviously that. But Mi'utei Ra means here Ra, like Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Sitra Achra doesn't mean evil. It just means the other side. It's not kulei bottle. What does Alter Rebbe say in Perek Vav? That Kedusha means something that's completely bottled to Elokus. So if something is 99% bottled, but not 100%, you could already call that a little sitrach. So Ra here doesn't mean evil, it means the beginning of a Metzias that's not kulei eined movade. Avram, or the Ovis and Merkava, there was no room for anything else. Even when you say chet by the Ovis, the Rebbe explains chet beloshach chsodin. It's not for now, right now, but the point being, it's not a real chsodin, meaning it's not a real negative. It's not as good as it could be. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Lamed Zayin, that the Neshama Lamata, and Neshama Sadikim, when they come Lamata, they never can have the same Ava V'yira as they have Lamaila without a guf. That's only because their Madrega, they could be on a higher level. So the point of Beriyah is that the beginning of the Metzias of Elam, that of course the Kavona is Dira B'Tachtenim. So Tachtenim means Tachtenim, complete Helam, as he explains in Perek Lamed Vav and Tanya. But how do you get to Tachtenim? You can't get there if you don't first have, before you get to Asiyah, Atachten Shen Tachten Lamatim Mimenu, in Helam, in Helam of Elokus, you first have to have the Madrega of Beriyah, which is the beginning of the Helam. Yitzira becomes more intense, Asiyah even more so, all the way till all the Halamas of this world. So Beriyah plays a role of being like the bridge when you're crossing over from Elam HaAchdus, a pure Elokus, but in Elamus, because Atzilus is an Elam, it's a Metzias. We're not talking about a world that's not a Metzias. So go from Metzias to Yesh is this transition from the two. So when we say the Eibishter, we Mamlech the Eibishter Rosh Hashanah, we're basically saying we want the Eibishter's Malchus of Atzilus to have a relationship with us in Beriyah, Yitzira, Asiyah. So that's the Nekudas Advarim, and this is the beginning of, we'll talk more obviously about Beriyah and the later worlds as well. And with that, let us wish each other Aksiv Chsimateva, good Geben Shiur, and we will all come back renewed, even more than Esav is B'Chorega. Rosh Hashanah is even a bigger renewal. And a good Geben Shiur. Be well.